On this week's Live with Littlewood, nearly 400,000 pupils were self-isolating yesterday. The job market looks bleak, house prices are shooting up. Is it time to mend the intergenerational breach in British society? And after the Hancock up, we have a new health secretary who insists we must learn to live with the virus. With Sarge in situ, is freedom coming home as well as football? And can he solve a problem like the NHS? All of that coming up on this week's show. Kaboom, kapow, welcome to another episode of Live with Littlewood, with me, Mark Littlewood, the Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs, for a kind of free market look at the big stories of the week. Coming up later on this week's show, our football team may have beaten the Germans, but our health system lags far behind them in terms of quality and outcomes. Is it time to stop clapping for the NHS and instead subject it to some serious reform? The man who'll be at the centre of this storm is the new Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, who's already insisted that restrictions must end on the 19th of July, of course. But just how likely is it that we're actually going to get our freedom back in 3 weeks' time? But first up, while the old have been hit hardest by the health impact of coronavirus, our policy response has disproportionately impacted on the young. To consider the implications here, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined for his first appearance on the show by Robert Halfon, MP, Chair of the Education Select Committee. Robert, good evening to you. How the very devil are you, sir?
Good evening. It's a great honour to be on the IA event, so thank you for inviting me.
Lovely to have you, Robert. And also for her first appearance on the show, a very warm welcome to presenter, writer and self-described lapsed comedian, Timandra Harkness. Timandra, how are you? Good to have you with us.
I'm very well. It's great to be here. Well, I mean, virtually.
To be virtually here.
And actually here as usual, yeah.
So we're calling this section, The Kids Aren't All Right, a kind of paraphrase of that line from the Who song. And we're going to be asking, are we finally putting children first? Yesterday, the Department for Education published data showing that more than 375,000 pupils are off school, self-isolating as a result of COVID, equal to over 5% of all children in England and up 60% in a single week. And this is essentially because entire classes are sent home if a single child has a positive COVID test. The Children's Commissioner has urged ministers to end these bubbles and self-isolation and warns of trauma being inflicted on a generation of children. Robert, let me start with you, the Children's Commissioner. Are they right?
Well, the last 18 months has been nothing short of a national disaster for our young people. I've described it as the four horsemen of the COVID education apocalypse galloping towards our children in terms of lost education, mental health problems, safeguarding hazards, and we know a loss of lifetime earnings up to £40,000, according to the Institute of Fiscal Studies. And you just cited the figure of 350,000 pupils. There's another awful figure, which is 93,500 pupils who should be in school are not in school. They're lost to the system. No one knows where they are. There aren't proper records of these pupils, why they're not back in school, why they haven't been back in school at all. And what we are doing is in danger of creating, I call it ghost children, children lost to education. We're damaging their life chances. We're stopping them climb the education ladder of opportunity. And it has to be a priority for the government to deal with.
Timandra, what's your take on this? I mean, I'm no scientist, but I gather that if kids get COVID, they don't tend to get it too horrifically. They could spread it, of course, onto their parents and grandparents. But it seems a bit of a rum state of affairs, doesn't it? That school kids are having their education ripped up. Where, to be honest with you, we're so close to having got over this pandemic, and youngsters getting the illness is not as horrific as older people getting it. Shouldn't we just be shoveling people back into the classrooms?
Well, I'm afraid this is going to make this a terrible broadcast, but I am basically just going to agree and say it's a terrible thing that, given how low the chances are that school kids pass on even COVID, certainly primary school kids, there's very, very low rates of them taking it home, passing it on. As the teenagers get older, they start to behave a bit more like adults and present a bit more of a risk, but the risk to them is absolutely minute. I mean, it's the risk to kids in general is so small that I'm not sure there's any justification at all for giving them vaccinations, because you're basically asking children to take a risk of being vaccinated in order to protect adults who might catch COVID from them. So, yeah, I really think it's been a terrible thing to have closed schools at all, ever. I'm going to stick my neck right out and say closing schools is one of the things we should never, ever have done, because the impact both on the kids, and it's not just their formal education, it's also their social education. You know, they learn from each other, they learn how to relate to each other, they learn how to be social creatures, but also the impact on the parents. I mean, working parents have been expected to work from home and homeschool their kids at the same time, which is clearly an impossible task. I mean, it is, yeah, there has been some talk of this has fallen disproportionately on women, and I'm pretty sure it has, but that's almost a kind of secondary thing, that actually all parents have been really struggling to do their normal work from home and homeschool their kids. And the kids are not designed to be locked up at home with their parents for the first 18 years of their lives.
Yeah. Rob, we might say it's a sorry state of affairs that we've got to, whether one sympathises with the policies the government has rolled out or not. But from here, rather than saying we wouldn't start from here, what's the solution now? Should we just say, look, obviously if a kid gets COVID, they should stay at home, perhaps until they test negative, but everybody else, pack them into the classrooms? Is there a danger that because we're getting to the end of the school year, we'll say, well, let's look at all of this again in September, sort of, we've disrupted kids so much, so what if we disrupt them for, the last few weeks of the school year?
Yeah, well, that's what the government is saying. They're saying that things will change in September, but I think September is too long. There's just under a month to go before the end of the school term. And then a number of things need to happen. First of all, we need to keep our kids in school. If we need to test pupils and schools don't have the facilities, we should have mobile testing units to test the pupils if necessary, if there are outbreaks within the school. But we know children are at very low risk. I think that the government have got to have a kind of three-pronged strategy. First of all, to deal with what's happened, the pandemic, the catch-up money, the $3 billion, that will help with part of it, but only goes some of the way. It's a starter, not the main course. There are bigger issues in education, like the lack of attainment between disadvantaged pupils and their better off peers. About 18 months at the moment by the time that kids get to GCSEs. And there are also great social injustices in education. What I mean by that is we've just published a report on white working class boys and girls. So only 17% of white working class boys on free school meals, just over 17% get decent passes in maths and English, just 16% get to university, and the government have to address this. And the third thing is we are facing the incoming fourth industrial revolution. The world of automation and AI is soon to be upon us. We need to look at our curriculum and make it much more vocational, and start preparing, ensuring that our school system is preparing children for the world of work. Because of course you go to school to get an education and get intellectually developed, but at the end of the day, it's about climbing that ladder, and the top of that ladder is about jobs, security and prosperity. And that will only happen if you can get a job and if you have the right skills to get those jobs.
Rob, a lot to parcel out there. I want to dig into each part of that in turn. Can I start by asking you, before I bring Timandra back in, so let's just focus on the immediate catch-up, right? I think the average school kids lost well over 100 days of education this year. I think it's about 115 days is the average number of days lost. What should be done here? I mean, if people can't go away on holiday over the summer, should we have summer schools? Should we extend the school day next year? What's the immediate catch-up plan for the next, I don't know, 6 weeks, 6 months, 6
So
years,
you're
I
right
guess.
that pupils are months behind in reading and in mathematics. And surprise, surprise, the disadvantaged pupils are faring even worse. They've done the least learning during lockdown, were less likely to do any kind of remote learning at all. So absolutely, the catch-up tuition program needs to be in full force, but we need to think out of the box. We should have longer school days to help these children catch up, not just with academic activities, but also sporting, mental health, well-being, enrichment activities, because we know all the evidence, all the statistics show that if you do those things, you actually increase academic attainment as well. And we have to think imaginatively. I'd like to see the government come up with a long-term plan for education in the same way that I know you're discussing the NHS later, but the NHS has a long-term plan. Defence has a long-term plan and a strategic review and a secure funding settlement. The same should happen to education. All the energies of the catch-up programme should be directed towards the most disadvantaged. I mean, currently, just 44% of pupils on free school meals are getting access to the catch-up programme. In the southwest, it's close to 100% of take-up of the catch-up programme. In the northeast, it's 58%. So again, there's huge regional disparities. So these have to be addressed. And my worry about the catch-up programme, it's going to go to those aspirational families. Of course, they need help too, absolutely, and they will have suffered mental health difficulties. But if we don't help the disadvantaged recover, as I say, we're going to have a lost generation. And then we also have to deal with the 93,500 pupils who are not back in school at all. It's not even a question of being sent home. They just haven't come back to school. And there has to be some kind of coordinated action from the government, from Ofsted, from the police, from the local authorities, proper parental engagement programs to find these kids and get them learning again.
Timandra, what would your catch-up plan be? You know, you said that in your hands you wouldn't have shut the schools down, but you know we are where we are.
We are where we are. Yeah. I don't know. It's a good question. I mean, I'm not an educationalist, so thankfully I don't have to directly do that. There was talk early on this year of just saying, well, all pupils should repeat a year. And obviously that's a bit impractical because you'd still got the cohort coming in at the bottom of the school system, and where are they going to go? But in the scale of lost work, I think demands that kind of thing. Or you just say, well, here's a generation who have just not learned a load of stuff and they will just have to catch up with it at some point later in their life. I think the whole exam thing has been really peculiar here, because by saying, oh, well, you can't examine kids in normal exams because they haven't covered the whole curriculum, you're kind of like covering up the fact that they have missed whole chunks of work. It's like, oh, but you couldn't examine them on that because they haven't been taught it. Like, well, if they haven't been taught it, then maybe the exam should reflect that. Maybe the exam should say, actually, you've only learned 2/3 of what you should have learned on this course. And that's the third that we have to make up somehow, somewhere, whether it's universities putting in an access year to bring people up to speed or whatever it is. But I think not doing the exams is a complete fudge. It's like, well, are you trying to pretend that everything's fine and these kids are in the same state as they would have been if they'd done their A-levels normally? Because we all know that's not true. So why have you tried to pretend and give them an exam grade equivalent to a normal year when we all know that they've missed maybe 1/3 of the curriculum?
And Timandra is absolutely right. The problem is that what's happened is that we're baking a rock cake of grade inflation into the system. And so if you're an employer and you're about to interview two people who are it's hard for you to decide, but one is the 29 intake who's done exams, and one is the 2020 or 2021 intake who has done the graded assessments. Which one are you going to choose? You're probably going to choose the exam person. So this generation is going to be disadvantaged. And my worry is that given all the amount of pupils who are missing school at the moment, that we will be faced with the same situation next year, that there won't be any exams at all, even with the good intentions of the government saying that there will be, but that we'll come to January or February next year and they'll say, no, there's been too many lessons lost, and we'll be back to graded assessments. And again, as I say, baking a hard rock cake of grade inflation into the system.
Before I move on to wider issues affecting younger people, Rob, maybe I could ask you a bit more. You said, on the long-term sort of future strategic plan for education, once we've worked out how best to deal with the catch-up that this last horrific year requires us to do. And you were saying education should be more vocational, perhaps. It needs to train you for life, but it also needs to train you for work. What would you really like to see change? I'm a bit skeptical about how prescriptive the national curriculum is. Obviously, we've got to teach kids to read, write, add up, but I'm a bit worried that we've got kind of Whitehall telling every school exactly when, in Key Stage 5, you need to teach some kid Act 2 of Macbeth. Shouldn't we allow schools to experiment a bit more, perhaps specialise a bit more?
So I've got great respect for Nick Gibb. I like him very much. I think he's a conviction politician, and he has done everything possible to try and improve standards in schools, improve literacy particularly, and he should be credited for that. But my disagreement with him is that he believes completely in a knowledge-based education system. Now, I believe in a knowledge education system, but my difference with him is I do think education, I've argued this with him on the pages of Conservative Home and in my committee, that education should be about preparing pupils for the world of work, especially with the changes that are coming with the fourth industrial revolution. So I would introduce design and technology as part of the EBAC. I would get rid of A levels from the age 16 onwards, and have an international baccalaureate that included vocational as well as academic education. I would have a system where we had 50% of students doing degree apprenticeships. So you earn while you learn, you have no debt, you don't worry about a loan system, and you get a skilled job at the end of it. You get the skills that our country needs, but you also get a job at the end. To me, it's a no-brainer, and I would have, my target would be 50% of students doing degree apprenticeships over the next 10 years, the higher apprenticeships. We need to do a lot more to encourage all kinds of apprenticeships, but all the proper progression all the way through from level 2 to higher apprentices. I'd also look at teaching, because we have a problem with teacher recruitment. So a third of new teachers leave the profession after about 5 years, and we don't get the teachers in disadvantaged areas that we need. And if you I'd introduce local training providers in areas of disadvantage, and I'd also allow teachers to train doing teaching degree apprenticeships. We have nursing degree apprenticeships, we have policing degree apprenticeships, but why not allow teaching degree apprenticeships? I think that would encourage a lot more teachers to come into the profession, and I think they'd be more likely to stay. We know that those who do apprentices are much more loyal to the organisations that they've done them with, and stay on with that employer much longer, rather than switching jobs. So all the way through, we need to look at our education system and bring in much more vocational and technical, and give it a parity of esteem, because at the moment it's always seen as something lesser to do. And just to sum it all up, it's not, what Nick says, well, you have to learn the names of fish in a river because it gives you cognitive dissonance and that enables you to do interviews. That may be the case, but I want to make sure that pupils learn how to fish as well as learn the names of the fish. And that is my difference between myself and the schools minister, who, as I say, I respect hugely.
Timandra, what would your prescription be? I'm interested in a lot of the ideas that Robert's put forward. I think my view would be to allow schools to develop their own curriculum a lot more, and you might have specialist schools for particular types of vocational training, others that are more weighted, I don't know, to medieval poetry. Let a thousand flowers bloom, I think, would be kind of my view. What would your prescription be, Timandra?
Specialist school maybe in Canterbury that mainly teaches Chaucer. Well, this is me where I do very much disagree. I don't think it's the job of schools to prepare kids for work. I think that's the job of employers, and I think we see this a lot now in education. Education is regarded as vocational. Universities are regarded as vocational. Employers go, well, this is no good. Somebody studies this history degree and they come out and they're not prepared to step into a job. Like, well, when did we ever expect people to be able to step into a job? It's the job of an employer to train somebody to do the job if they want to employ them for it. Now, I do agree that we have tended to weight academic study and not weight non-academic skills. And And I think one of the results of that is that we have masses of people going straight from school to university because that's what they're told you have to do to get a good job. And they study something they're not that interested in, and it's a sausage factory, and they don't even get to study it really in any depth because it's just massive groups of students churning out essays going, why haven't I got a good enough mark for this essay? I'm paying £9,000 a term. And the idea of scholarship and learning is completely falling apart. So I do think there's an argument for saying, look, just don't, if there's nothing you're desperately keen to study, and you haven't got a vocation that for which you need to go study, like, you know, medicine or being a vet or whatever, or an engineer, don't go to university. Leave school at 18, go and get a job. Employers should train you to do whatever job, because most 18-year-olds, they're quite adaptable. You could train them to do an 18-year-old level job. And later on, maybe when you're 25 and you suddenly develop a passion for Chaucer or medieval poetry,
and off to Canterbury University
or,
you go,
or whatever,
for
then
your
off you go and study something you really care about and pursue that. And maybe that's still not even your career. Maybe you do this part-time while you're being a train driver or whatever. But I don't think it's the job of schools to say, well, we're just not turning you out with the skills that employers need like that. Obviously they need technical skills and mathematics and to understand technology, because that is, you know, we are heading into the digital world. We're already in the digital world. In fact, most kids probably are ahead of us and us three on digital skills. But so in terms of that, in terms of the basic curriculum and knowledge and skills, yes, but I would be really sad to see teenagers being told, because I remember, right, I went to a comprehensive state school, girls' comprehensive state school, and it was very heavily streamed. Some of us were told we could study Latin. Some of us were told we could do electronics. I actually was quite interested in electronics, and they went, oh, no, you don't want to do that. No. That's not for the that's not for the girls in the top math stream. No, you stick with maths and physics and
Chaucer
and Chaucer and Latin. And it was this very definite sense of, you know, if you weren't up to doing the academic stuff, then you go and learn some practical skills. And I think that's so wrong.
The wrong way around.
Can I
Rob, I know you want to come back in.
I've got to just come back on 2 points. So you'll let flowers, the Maoists let the flowers bloom. I'm actually in favour of that as long as you judge outcomes. Because, so for example, I love the Michaelis School. I think Catherine Burblesing is a Ronseal type head teacher. She does what it says on the tin. She calls a spade and takes no nonsense. That school succeeds. So if you could replicate that, I'd be very happy. But I also love the XP Academy in Doncaster, which primarily has great outcomes, great inspection results from Ofsted, yet also has much more vocational based curriculum. And I think we should allow those to flourish much more than we do, as long as we judge things on outcomes. And I just finally say, if schools aren't preparing pupils for the world of work, we might as well pack up and go home. We face a very difficult situation in the future in terms of the jobs market. With COVID, as I say, with the fourth industrial revolution, there's so many statistics out there. 28% of jobs done by young people could be lost to automation by 2030. We have to make sure that we are skilling and reskilling our younger population and our adult population, making sure if they can't get a job, they will not be able to succeed in life. And that's what education must be about. But
that's not the job of education. That the problem is not that the education is not teaching the kids to do whatever it is job that a robot is not going to take, whatever that is. The problem is that the jobs aren't there. That is a whole separate problem. And you can't put that on schools and put that on kids and say, your problem is that when you were 13, you did not learn the right programming language, which incidentally is a doomed thing, because
it's not just
if you teach them something, programming language at 13, then by the time they're 18, people will be using a different language. So too much specialization is going to leave.
I'm not saying that you could prepare people in school for all kinds of careers and jobs, and I'm just making the point that
you don't do the job of the employer to train them in the skills that they need for that job. That's the employer's task.
Timandra,
Right.
and Robert, stay with us. My producer's screaming in my ear because I'm fascinating, but I'm running way over time. And there's another area of the young that I want us to focus on. I'm delighted to welcome back to the show political commentator, good friend of mine, very good friend of the IEA, regular on the programme, Alex Deane. Alex, great to have you with us. Thanks for joining us.
Great discussion.
Sorry to delay your entry a bit while Robert and Timandra are going out at hammer and tong, but that's what we pay them the big bucks for, right? So good to have you with us, Alex.
Thank you.
I wanted to move on to the wider question. We're calling this section Mind the Gap, the generation gap. In a bit of completely unapologetic self-publicity, I write a bi-weekly column for the Times. And on Monday, I wrote a column titled "Class War May Largely Be Behind Us, but the Generation Wars Are Just Beginning." Now, we touched in the first part of the programme about the catch-up that school children are going to have to face. Rob was mentioning the impact it could have on their future salaries, tens of thousands of pounds knocked off. But it seems to me that this affects young people of above school age as well, the general state of politics and economics in Britain. More than half of people aged between 21 and 34 say they've put significant life events on hold during the lockdown. 2/3 of young people claim that their mental health has been adversely affected. That's not just self-reporting, that's backed up by antidepressants being prescribed to young people. About 1/10 of workers under 25 have lost their jobs. 6 out of 10 workers under 25 have seen their wages fall, even if they've stayed in work. Alex, what's your take on this? Am I right that class war is over and generation war is now the big divide in our society, in economic terms at least?
Those things are not mutually exclusive. And I know that there are many people who would point to the lockdown that we had and say that it was middle class people who were staying in their homes and being served foodstuffs and deliveries by working class people. And they would point to, the fact that people on 0 hours jobs couldn't refuse work as they perceived it to be, and that the class war is there for anyone who wants to perceive it in the way that we had on middle class lockdown. That would be the left wing critique, I think, of lockdown, and that would suggest that there is still a class war. I think there are 2 other areas I would point to, both of which used to be uncontroversial in our country and now are controversial. The first is that in my father's generation and older than that people would very often say, my big chance in life was when I was sent to a grammar school. It was the opportunity to be reborn in educational terms, to realize something that I didn't know I had in myself before. And frankly, it was my way out of very difficult personal circumstances and family background. And that brought me, I know we still have grammar schools in pockets of the country, and I know that we want to aspire to have all schools be equally good. But nevertheless, that's something you don't hear anymore. That is a generational divide. An increasingly old cohort of people say the making of me was grammar schools. And that has broadly speaking in the country, gone. And the second area I would want to focus on in that, and this is a huge point about generational inequality, is home ownership and housing development and the ownership that comes from that. And the Conservative Party, to which I unapologetically belong, continues to believe that we need to build more homes, but the narrative goes, took it on the chin in Chesham and Amersham for saying that. For believing that we need more housing development in that by-election. So one of the things I think is important, if we're going to avoid greater generational inequality, is not learning the wrong lessons from the by-election we just had, and to continue to believe that one of the most empowering things you can do to young people is to let them get on the housing ladder, is to let them realise their aspiration to own property. And after all, Chris Patten had this phrase, if home ownership stutters and stops, in the end, the facts of life no longer are conservative. And you run the risk of doing that when home ownership in this country is as bad, as low as it is now.
Rob, let me come back to you. Do you think in the round, we focused obviously on the top of the show on school children and the plight they've been facing, but in the round, youngsters in general are getting the thin end of the wedge, aren't they? Alex has mentioned house prices. If you own a house, they've gone up 13.4% over the last year, a completely average house. If you own it, you've made about 30 grand, about the same as the national average wage. If you're not on the property ladder, God knows how you're going to get on the property ladder. It's a pretty bleak time for those, I don't know, let's say 30 and under, Robert, isn't it? And, everybody's doing everything to protect everybody 65 and over, but this has got to cut both ways, surely.
Yeah, so do you mind if I just quickly comment on what Alex said about grammar schools? So I'm very supportive of grammar schools. I love the concept of it. I'd be very happy to have one in my constituency. The issue, however, with grammar schools is just the 3 or 4% of grammar school pupils are free school meal pupils or from disadvantaged backgrounds. And if we are to have grammar schools, they've got to do a lot better and have people from genuine disadvantaged backgrounds, who should be a significant amount of the grammar school population. On the housing, I completely with Alex, as I understand this, and I was told it was a apocryphal story, but I've now been told it's true, that we have more golf courses in the United Kingdom than we have land that has houses on it. 90% plus of our land is not built on. We have 1 million people living in overcrowded accommodation, and we have to build houses. And the problem is there is a NIMBY attitude across our party. I understand everyone loves the green and pleasant England, but we are going to have to make some sacrifices because we need more houses. We need to ensure that they are affordable so that people can become buyers. And there was a fascinating Economist article some months ago, Economist magazine, which suggested that actually one of the reasons that we won the northern seats wasn't just because of Brexit, but actually because new housing suburbs had been built and there were first-time buyers and owners in some of those constituencies. And I'm completely with Alex that we ignore housing and affordable housing at our peril. And yes, young people have been forgotten about. As all the attention over the pandemic has been on the economy and on the health service, and not on young people and not on education. It hasn't had nearly as much support. There have been some good things the government have done, but if you compare what's gone on in the economy and health, and even defence, which recently had a £16 billion increase in their budget over the next few years, education and young people have fallen by the wayside, and that has to change because there is a complete unfair balance between other areas of government and how we are looking after young people in our country.
Timandra, what's your take on this? Am I right that of course classes still matters? I think it might matter a bit less. That's not to say that advantage and disadvantage don't matter, but it does seem to me that there's been almost a perfect storm for young people, whether it's been their lives on hold during COVID or younger down the spectrum, their education disrupted, or the impossibility of getting on the housing ladder. The NIMBYs are winning, or I think there's a new term for NIMBY now. It's no longer NIMBY, it's banana, which stands for build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone, which seems to have been the policy to date. What's your take on it, Timandra? How bad a deal youngsters under 30s getting?
I think it is pretty bad for the young. But I think the two things intersect. That's the thing. Is what the grammar school thing points to is that there was genuine social mobility in perhaps our parents' generation. I mean, both my parents went to grammar schools. Both of them, it completely took them out of their home background. So I definitely would not be the person I am had they not gone to grammar school. But the village I went to school in, we had a secondary modern school. So the other side of grammar schools is all the kids that don't go to grammar school, what kind of education do they get? They are told at 11 that they're not smart enough and they're destined for manual work, basically. And I think what we have today, interestingly, is we have a similar thing in the university, non-university divide, that yes, okay, half the cohort goes to university, although they're no longer getting elite graduate level jobs because half the cohort goes to university. People who don't go to university are really frozen out of all sorts of opportunities. You used to be able to not go to university, but maybe be a nurse, go into the post office, work your way up into the civil service by being a postman. Mm-hmm. You could work your way up through those routes, through the trade union movement, or having your own business, into Parliament. I mean, how many MPs now come from a non-university background? Almost none. So we still have that divide, but now it falls in a slightly different place. But I actually think it's much harder to be socially mobile for young people now. And money is part of that. So this is the other thing, is if your parents had property and you're going to inherit, then you are now in that able to buy property group. If your parents didn't own property, you're really stuffed now, because the chance of you earning enough to get into that position is really quite small. So it's less and less about what you earn and more about what you own. And that again is, I think, a big divide. But I think I mean, it's really hard to say, well, what should we do for young people? Should you punish the old who weren't killed by COVID by capping their pensions? Well, I think pretty sure the UK still has the worst state pension provision in Europe, so I wouldn't be in favour of that. I think the awful truth is, and this is not something we're going to answer in 3 minutes of a streamed discussion, is what the young need is economic growth, because economic growth has been stagnating over the decades. If we were still growing at, I don't know, 10% a year, if the economy was still growing at 10% a year, you could look at that now at 25 and go, well, that's fine. By the time I'm retired, the economy will have grown massively. There will be plenty of resources there. We're going to grow our way out of this problem. But it's not. The economy is not
flatlining, more or less.
How you solve that, I don't know. You guys at the Institute of Economic Affairs might have a few ideas.
We talk of little else here. We haven't cracked it yet.
Well, sort it out, because it's been going on for decades and you haven't fixed it yet.
Yeah, the long-term growth rate's a bit of a problem. I mean, I think taxes, regulation and spending are too high, but, tough decisions to be made on spending.
You look at America, they've got the same problem, but...
we've got the same problem right across the Western world.
I'd say it's the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, but then I would say that.
Timandra and Robert, just before I let you go, and I know Alex wants to come back in. Alex, I will bring you back in a minute, but I've taken up too much of Robert and Timandra's time. I didn't warn you at the start that we have a Live with Littlewood optimism barometer. This is a highly market sensitive number where I ask all of my guests how optimistic they're feeling about Britain over the next few years, say 4 or 5 years, where naught is that you are tearing your hair out and you think Britain is going to become North Korea. But 10 is that you think Britain's going to be near as damn it paradise in 5 years' time. So it needs to be an integer between 0 and 10, no fractions, no two numbers. You've got to pick a number. Timandra, let me start with you. How optimistic over the next
Well, if you hadn't said an integer, I might have picked pi, because I think we're heading to irrational time.
I've got to divide them all up at the end. So, decimal point, infinite numbers of decimal points get complex. Yeah.
Okay, so if we say the next 5 years, I'm naturally optimistic, but I think at the moment, Britain is in a very risk-averse state. I think at all levels, I think governments, institutions, but also I think the majority of the citizens are in a very risk-averse mood. And I think that's going to hold us back. So I'm going to say 5.
5, middle of the road 5. Robert, are you feeling a bit pluckier than that? What's your number for the highly market sensitive Live with Littlewood barometer?
So I'm probably going to agree with Timandra. I'm going to say 5, because I think we could go one way or the other. I think we have to be radical, come up with some real exciting, bold policy solutions, and we can't just muddle through this. Otherwise, it will fall way below 5. So I genuinely think we could go well, or we could fall backwards.
So you think it's probably going to be a 0 or a 10, but you don't know which. So
I think it's 50-50. We could go one or the other. Depends how bold we are coming out of this pandemic.
Well, Timandra and Robert, thanks very much for joining us and for your bold thoughts. Great to have you on the show. Look forward to welcoming you back soon. Thanks for taking the time to be with us. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Stay safe, stay free, and see you soon. Alex, I know you wanted to come back in on a point about the young. I don't know whether it was about housing, but the floor is yours just before we bring in our next two guests.
Thank you very much. It seems a bit unfair to seek to answer Timandra's point after she's just left. But
there you go. No right of reply on this. We're the IP holder of this show. That's the way it goes. The dog eat dog world out there.
Someone actually, but John Mills, the largest ever donor to the Labour Party, I think it's fair to say a man of the left, always offered as part of his critique and the argument for the left-wing case for Brexit, that the productivity problem, which is what Timandra was talking about there, the stagnant levels of growth, you really improve your productivity, goes the logic, when you invest in automation, technology and power. And you've got no incentive to invest in any of those areas whilst you can still use ultra cheap labour. And so part of the benefit of being able to control your borders is to ensure that you, in reducing the supply of ultra cheap labour, you coerce employers, goes the logic, to invest more in the things that will improve your productivity. Lo and behold, Mark, a combination of Brexit and the coronavirus, removing ultra low wage people from the UK economy from other countries, has meant significant investment in any number of things involving automation. This means, for example, and it's part of the reason we've got such high wage inflation. People are paying others a great deal more to do jobs, the same jobs, than they were being paid to do last year. This is good. We should welcome this sort of thing in the economy, and it's improving productivity. But it also means some of the innovations we've seen around the coronavirus epidemic are very likely to stay with us. So you're very likely to continue ordering via an app at your table and having fewer wait staff than you are to have a heavily manned bar in a pub. Why? Because automation has succeeded in this time when employers were coerced to do it, and they're paying those people who do have those remaining jobs more. So you might say that's win-win. I know that there are others who will disagree with that, but that's a useful answer, I think, on that productivity conversation.
Alex, stay with us. Rob, thank you very much for joining us. I can see in the chat somebody wants to send their thanks to Robert. James Cooper says, as a parent, thank you to Robert Halfon for helping get the schools open again earlier this year. Once again, much done, much left to do. Let's bring in two more guests now. Delighted to be joined by CapX editor John Ashmore, and from the home team, the IEA's very own head of lifestyle economics, Christopher Snowdon. Chris, good evening to you. How are you in your man cave?
Not bad, thanks, Mark. Nice to see you. Always a pleasure, never a chore.
Always a pleasure, never a chore. James is right that my haircut wasn't quite sub £8. It was £11, worth every penny. And we're also joined by John Ashmore, CapX's editor. Very good evening to you, John. Thank you very much for joining us.
Hi, Mark. Good to be with you.
Good to have you with us. Listen, I want to move on to the March to Freedom. England managed to stay in the Euros yesterday by beating Germany 2-0. Football's coming home. We're calling this section the short march to July the 19th. Is freedom coming home? We have a new health secretary now after the mishaps of Matthew Hancock. His career has gone into reverse. Sajid Javid becomes our new health secretary, his fifth cabinet position. Quite extraordinary, actually. He's had quite a political career already for someone relatively young in his political career. So is July the 19th going to be it? We've discussed several times on this show whether is it going to be, was it June the 21st? Wasn't that the first date? Is it really all going to end on July the 19th? John, let me start with you. Are you confident that the restrictions really are going to come to an end, and freedom, football will be coming home when England win on July the 11th, and freedom will be coming home when all the restrictions end on July the 19th? Or am I being ridiculously optimistic here?
No, I don't think you're being ridiculously optimistic about the government lifting remaining restrictions. But I think there's a distinction between the government changing things and us, if you like, living a different kind of life because of COVID. And I think there'll be lots of features of the way we live that continue for quite a long time. I'm thinking of things like traveling and having to have a certificate or something on an app to show that you've been vaccinated, things like that. So there might be some things that people find very annoying. I think there will also almost certainly be private venues that make demands of people that people find absurd. I wouldn't be surprised if in 6 months' time you have lots of newspaper stories which are things along the lines of venues still demanding distancing and masks and stuff like that, because this kind of what's called in some quarters safetyism has kind of infected every stratum of our society. It's not just the government imposing things, it's often people taking things further than the government even demanded in the first place. So I don't think July the 19th marks some kind of Rubicon after which everything will go back to February 2020. So in that sense, I'm not particularly optimistic, but I do think that those remaining sort of state restrictions will be lifted then. Yeah.
Chris, we can always count on you to spread some doom and gloom, even in the afterglow of England's victory over Germany last night. What are your thoughts on July the 19th and a bounce back to freedom, or like John, do you think it could be rather more partial than that?
No, actually, I'm going to be quite optimistic about this one. I think it really is a race between the vaccines and the virus. We kind of already knew that, but it's a much more exciting race than most people thought a couple of months ago. I mean, there's just been over 20,000 new cases in England reported today. That's the first time for a very long time. The number of infections seems to be doubling nearly every week, or in the last week it's doubled nearly. I mean, this is on paper quite worrying stuff, right? And if it continues at that rate, then we'll have a higher caseload than we did when we went into lockdown in January, I think. But you can't be an anti-vaxxer about this. You've got to be confident, and there's no doubt whatsoever that, to borrow a cliche, the link between hospitalizations, deaths, and infections has been broken. Scotland is really the big test case, because things have gone insane in Scotland, partly as a result, apparently, of Euro 2020, actually, according to Public Health Scotland today, by about 2,000 cases involved in people who've just gone to London, not just to the game. In fact, most of them hadn't been to the game, but they've been on the trains, they've been in the pubs, they've been in places where they could catch the virus. I mean, there's certainly scope for infections to increase a lot, and I think the government has to hold its nerve, and I think it will do. This is the thing, I think it will do, partly because it's got no real choice. I mean, we have tried everything now. If vaccines turn out not to work, and they do, but if they turn out not to work and things go south, there's nothing the government can do about it. If we get a new variant, which is more deadly, evades the vaccines, nothing we can do about it. We're not going to go into lockdown for another 18 months where we try and develop a new vaccine. So certainly in my view, and I suspect in the view of many people in government, we have done everything we can now. And if people now die, then there's, I'm sorry, but there's nothing we can do. We've been through 18 months of this nightmare. We have to put our faith in science. And I'm pretty sure that science will pull through.
Alex, you're a very keen and plugged-in observer of the political scene and senior and conservative politics in particular. What's your take on our new health secretary? I mean, he's been a major feature in British politics for some time. I said how amazing it was that he'd had 5 cabinet jobs. Somebody in the chat has said 5 cabinet positions, this is William Hill, is not something to be proud of. It's a sign of short-termism in government, which might be a very fair point. But my impression is that he's keener to end the restrictions than his predecessor, Matt Hancock. Do you think that's right? And do you think that means July the 19th is going to be some sort of Freedom Day?
Well, I think they're probably both pretty keen to end the restrictions, and it's just the timing suits Javid more. And certainly he's inclined in that direction philosophically. I know that because of the time I've spent with him, not least at a couple of IEA events where he has been a kind of leading light on the freedom-minded side of the philosophical discussion. One point I would make to Chris about, because you are right about the rising case numbers, is that the last time we had cases over 20,000 cases in the UK, a day in the UK, we were testing at about a third of the rate. So we've increased our rate of testing by 3 to get back up to 20,000 cases. And so on the one hand, it's the concern about the rising cases, which threatens July. And on the other hand, it's the point that Chris rightly made about decoupling hospitalization and mortality from the increasing rate. In the end, we're going to have to learn to live with a certain amount of coronavirus. Otherwise, we'll be saying that we're never going to unlock. And at that point, we are truly lost. I think the maddest graph I've seen in the entirety of this 24-month period of madness is the one that shows the rate of children coming home because of coronavirus yo-yoing wildly up and down, whilst the rate of children being infected with coronavirus remains a very steady, low beat that looks like the patient is no longer with you and is in a coma, completely steady and unchanging. So there comes a point at which we've got to stop getting in a flap every time there's a little change in numbers and stick to our beliefs that freedom, once we're vaccinated enough, freedom is acceptable and right and must be pursued. In my considered view, that is going to be July and we're not going to veer from it.
Well, you see, here's my problem. I think statistics are often badly misused, and I've got a very, very contemporary example. By reading most of today's newspapers, you would have thought that England had not beaten Germany for 55 years, right? I mean, they do put all in the riders, but it's the most form, etc., etc. Here is the record between England and Germany in matches in major tournaments, so either the Euros or the World Cup, since the end of the Second World War. England have won 3 matches, Germany have won 2, and there have been 3 draws, 2 of which went to penalties that Germany won. But it's actually England 3, Germany 2 on straight wins, 3 draws, penalty wins are counted as draws. Pretty even Stevens, but you would have thought from the statistical reporting that this is the first time we put a goal past Germany for half a century.
people like things to be exceptional, don't they? And it seems a particularly remarkable claim to make when I well recall us stuffing them 5-1 away in Germany. So I thought that was a bit much. But I have a serious point to make about the football, actually, which is I think that if we go any further, and I mean, I touch wood everywhere, if we win it, I think it becomes all the more difficult for anyone to suggest that we shouldn't unlock on time. Because I went out last night after the match and London was mental. It was just absolute carnage of people everywhere. And that's fantastic, right? It's going to be very difficult to repeat those scenes times 2 or 3, if heaven forbid we're in the final, go further. It's going to be exceptionally difficult for anyone to claim, okay, well done, hundreds of thousands of people had a nice time, but, you know, as you were, we're just going to stay on lockdown for another few weeks. It was a ridiculous mess. No one will accept it.
Yeah. John, do you think that's a fair point? Could actually, I might be reaching a bit here, but could football be what gets our freedoms back, right? But if you looked at the scenes from Wembley Stadium yesterday, or all the scenes from sort of bars up and down the land of people watching the match, it's fair to say that face mask wearing and social distancing was not obviously in abundance, right? People were hugging and jumping up and down. I went to the England-Scotland game. God, I do pick my matches, don't I? That was absolutely turgid and dire. And there were all these announcements all over the place, wear a face mask in the stadium. Nobody took any notice of that. Please practice social distancing. While 23,000 of us were packed in, queuing for the tube, you couldn't practice social distancing. Could it be that England's run in the Euros, John, actually, if you like, by just sort of force majeure, brings the restrictions to the end?
My view is that they're going to bring the restrictions to the end regardless, but I think it will just make that decision even easier. I went to the Croatia game and I had exactly the same experience as you. It was ridiculous. Like, I mean, I didn't personally care, but if you did care about social distancing and mask wearing, then that game would have been a nightmare for you because no one was observing it. No one was even in the seats they were meant to be in. You know, it was ridiculous. And like Alex said, I mean, last night in the middle of London was just, you know, massive crowds everywhere. If we win, I don't even know if as a nation we're like psychologically prepared for actually winning something. I think we've built our identity on kind of being a bit crap. That's what our song is all about. I think I'm more worried about the kind of dislocation in the national psyche. We're going to need about a week off, I think. But yeah, no, my view is that we'll unlock anyway. I think in terms of Sajid Javid saying, oh, he wants to unlock, it's kind of a free hit for him. And it was his predecessor who put that date in the first place. So he would say that, wouldn't he? Although I agree with Alex, I think he's inclined that way anyway. He's also a politician and quite pragmatic. But yeah, I'm pretty optimistic on that front.
And Chris, do you think this sort of wave of optimism, I assume like me, you'll still be betting against England as the rational thing to do on the betting markets, but hoping they're going to win. Do you think this wave of Euro optimism, which by the way, could all end at 10 o'clock on Saturday night if Ukraine beat us, could this be a push to people getting their freedoms back just by choosing to do so, whatever the laws and regs say?
I think actually there's an argument for saying we would have unlocked on July the 5th had we got knocked out in the group stages, actually. I mean, it's quite a big thing in terms of social distancing to have these matches on. But like Alex and John have both just said, it doesn't make any difference. And, you know, there's a massive disconnect between what people think is going on. Talking about lockdown, we're still talking about lockdown. There isn't a lockdown. We haven't been in lockdown for at least 2 months. You can't possibly say that what we're living under now is in any way a lockdown. We've got some pretty fussy rules, which, as I said weeks ago, and I think in the Telegraph, they are epidemiologically unimportant, but economically quite significant. So they're costing pubs about £400 million. Just this delay is costing them about £400 million. It's really bad for a number of industries that are involved, like nightclubs being the obvious example, but a few others. And it's annoying if you want to have more than 6 people around your house, assuming you actually abide by that regulation, which I suspect most people don't. So this stuff is not actually having much impact. People are breaking the rules left, right, and center. They have been doing for weeks, if not months. We're just punishing a handful of industries who are suffering really badly, like in the case of nightclubs cannot open at all, for, from what I can tell, no real public health benefit. The reality is we fully unlocked really in May. We're seeing the results of that in terms of the infection rates definitely going up. I don't think it'd be any worse, really, if we'd have allowed nightclubs to open. As everyone's saying, people are going out cheering, hugging each other, kissing in the street, celebrating England. It's not making any difference to the virus. It's only having an effect on certain industries in the economy. So we should never have done it in the first place. Okay.
Well, look, we're sounding pretty optimistic. I think we're all agreed that England will win the final on July the 11th. Surely we got to hold the faith there. We seem to think that at least some freedoms are coming back on July the 19th. But I want to finish the programme, the show, by asking about other stuff in Sajid Javid's inbox. Obviously, he comes in to deal with what we very much hope is the tail end of restrictions and dealing with COVID. So even if freedom comes back on the 19th, hurrah for that, but that will hardly be the end of his job. It will just be the first hurdle he faces. We've spent, not for some months, but a good number of people were clapping and cheering about the NHS at 8 o'clock every Thursday. We haven't really spent much time considering how we might transform the NHS, if at all. And I don't know whether Sajid Javid's minded to turn his attention to that in the months ahead. Even before the pandemic, the NHS was often in crisis. We've now got more than 5 million people waiting for routine treatment, highest number ever recorded. 210,000 urgent cancer referrals were made by GPs in England in April 2021, more than double the number from a year earlier, in fact, nearly triple. Nearly 2.5 million people in England are currently waiting for cancer screening, further tests, or treatment. The backlog is absolutely enormous. The NHS is going to be in crisis forever, isn't it, John? Even when this pandemic ends, even if COVID disappears tomorrow, the back catalogue here is going to be an absolute nightmare to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote my last weekly briefing on the NHS and the kind of the Javid in tray, and going through all the things that he's facing is quite nightmarish. You mentioned there being 5 million people on the waiting list, but there's another estimate that there's actually more like 12 million because various people haven't even bothered coming forward yet because of the pandemic, which is pretty, I mean, 1 in 5 people almost waiting, could be, if you believe that estimate, waiting for treatment. And the other thing is, obviously, because of the delay, some people's conditions will have got worse. So you're going to see this kind of, I call it the kind of aftershocks of the COVID earthquake, if you like. And I think they're going to be going on for a very long time, notwithstanding all the problems that, you know, the likes of us have been writing about for many years, about it being sclerotic and monolithic and having poor outcomes on various things. I think that means that I'm interested to see what Sajid Javid does with there is another health and social care bill that's supposed to be making its way through Parliament, whether he just dumps that and says, you know, we've got to focus on dealing with the backlog, or if he plows on, because at the moment the NHS is in a kind of half space where it's sort of semi-reformed from the early years of the coalition, but then they paused it and didn't kind of see it through. My sense is that this government does not have, and Boris Johnson has neither the political inclination nor the temperament to go through with a politically difficult set of reforms on an issue that he thinks is politically really toxic for the Tories. So I wouldn't be that surprised if they just kind of parked it, kicked the can down the road, the same way they've done with social care, like successive governments have done, which is another item in his in tray, which they'll probably make a few noises about, commission a review, maybe have some cross-party talks and then do nothing about. So no, I'm not particularly optimistic. I'm certainly not optimistic about any kind of market-led reform of the system at all.
I knew we were going to finish on a downbeat note. Alex, what about you? Is it time for an NHS reformation? Do you think we might get one? Because, I mean, it looks like the backlog that it's going to have to cope with is going to be as complex and as nightmarish as almost as dealing with COVID itself. Will it at least provoke a national conversation, even if John is right and there isn't reforming zeal at the higher levels of government?
But it depends, doesn't it, about the spirit and mentality with which we approach those challenges. And if some of the versatility and flexibility that has been shown in getting up vaccination centres and so forth is applied from what we've done to what we do next, then I would be a great deal more optimistic, actually. And we've not just learned a great deal, which is an easy thing to say, we've shown it and implemented it as a country in a way that perhaps we don't say this often enough. We should be rather proud of the way that we've approached that. And I would say one more thing on that, which is, yes, coronavirus has been a terrible time to be sick with anything else. But as I was reflecting with you earlier in the show in a different context, it also forced us to do certain things that we could and arguably should have been doing anyway. Most GP consultations moved to online and by telephone. Now, could we have done that years ago? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Did we? No, because of huge inertia and people would have been reluctant to allow it to happen. Coronavirus meant that we had to. If we keep changes and reforms like that, yes, not everybody, yes, more people will be able to see their doctors in person, but if we maintain the option, which many people wanted, by the way, they'd rather see their doctor online, they'd rather not take much time out of the day to do it. It was more convenient for them. It was less embarrassing for them to, if they, people seeing them in their community and so forth. If we allow the maintenance of those options and keep some of the benefits of the flexibility we've shown, we could well have a much better NHS without asking too much more of it and without asking too much more funding for it. You just need a different model, and we've partially got down that route because of the flexibility we've shown in coronavirus.
Chris, what's your take? Look, I'm rather with John that I'm not expecting radical reform from this administration, probably not even from the next one. But do you think when we start to get to looking back on this, holding an inquiry into it and the rest of it, is it just going to be finger pointing? Or do you think, to take Alex's point, we might learn some of the lessons of the more flexible things we did well, and perhaps also compare some of the things that we didn't do so well with some of our European counterparts, and ask ourselves, even if immediate policy reform isn't on the agenda, whether things might be done differently, better in future, and whether we've learned some lessons over the last year about how those things might be better.
No, I don't think we're ever going to see any kind of meaningful reform in the NHS. It's the kind of thing that free marketeers like us like to talk about, but I think we all know it's kind of a hypothetical exercise. It's never going to really improve. I mean, to be fair, there are things that could be done within the NHS to make it better, which don't involve any element of privatization or bringing in competition or the kind of things you and I would like. But that doesn't seem like it's ever going to happen either. This cancer backlog is never going to be properly cleared. We haven't got enough doctors, we haven't got enough nurses, we haven't got enough hospital beds, we haven't got enough ICU beds. One of the eye-opening things about the pandemic for me was finding out just how few intensive care beds we had. When I found out that Delhi, which has a population of 9 million people, has more intensive care beds than the whole of the United Kingdom. It was quite shocking to find we only had 4,000. No wonder we have a winter crisis every single winter. Cancelling people who need cancer operations is not like a once in 100-year event for the NHS. It happens literally every year at winter. And in other countries, it very rarely happens. And so there are structural problems with the NHS that traditionally the left have kind of brushed away and said, well, this is due to underfunding. Well, the NHS hasn't been underfunded for some years. Even well before the pandemic, we were spending more than the OECD average. But we had so fewer doctors per 1,000 people, so fewer nurses, hospital beds especially, compared and the OECD, you got countries like Bulgaria and Turkey in there. We're not comparing it just with Switzerland and the USA. I don't know what the NHS spends its money on. That's what really frustrates me. It's like, well, if you're not spending it on hospitals and doctors and nurses, where's it all going? And I guess it's going to a whole lot of consultants and management people, and these people are going to fight for their privileges. And that's why you'll never get meaningful reform.
As President Reagan would say, somewhere there must be a lot of overhead. John, do you think we're going to get another winter crisis? As Chris was saying, comparing us to other countries, our colleague here at the IEA, Christian Niemitz, is a German. He writes quite a lot about healthcare systems. He tried to work out when, if ever, there had ever been a health winter crisis in Germany. It comes out every year now. It's almost a kind of national tradition. You can set your clock by it. And he had to go all the way back to the winter of 1945 to find any German newspaper or media outlet that was reporting a winter crisis. And obviously, Germany was in a pretty grim state in 1945. Are we going to have another winter crisis and then the same old arguments again? It's all underfunding, just one more heave, put more money into it. We're not spending as much as we should be. Is it just going to be rinse and repeat, this argument, or could there be a chink of light? If not, John, you were saying you weren't optimistic about the reforming nature of the government, but what about at least a public discussion about it?
I think there's one thing I'm not sure about this year, whether the number of people going in with flu might be lower just because sadly, so many people have died from coronavirus who might be in the group that you would expect to get flu. That, you know, maybe a data scientist could give you a more thorough answer on that. But I think in general, in the coming years, I see no reason why we won't continue to have these crises, because they're baked into the way the NHS operates. In terms of where the spending goes, I mean, there are things, as Chris said, where you don't have to reform the whole system to save money and do things better. We spend a lot of money, for instance, on medical compensation, which is a complete hodgepodge of a system. At the moment, we spend quite a bit of money on temporary staff as well. So you'll see that there are various vacancies, you know, 10 really high numbers of vacancies, 80,000 odd. And some of those aren't, the post is being filled, but by a temporary worker who's much more expensive. So there's some money going on stuff like that they could bring down. But yeah, I mean, it's a pretty shattered kind of workforce as well. I mean, there was a report recently by the Health Select Committee, which, you know, is chaired by a Tory, albeit Jeremy Hunt, who describes a kind of totally frazzled workforce where loads of staff are burnt out. And you know, I don't think he's particularly doing that for kind of political advantage. It's not like when the Royal College of Nursing or the BMA say it, and you think, well, you would say that because you're basically a trade union. So I am concerned about that, and I'm concerned about the knock-on effects that will have with care. Sorry if there's any background noise here, by the way. I've got a disgruntled toddler.
Most toddlers tend to be disgruntled in my experience, John. So I'm not surprised to hear that. Well, let me wrap up then, John, by asking you what's your optimism rating for this week on the highly market sensitive Live at Littlewood barometer? It's a 5-year time horizon.
Yeah. I'm in two minds. I mean, some of me is very pessimistic because of the sort of safetyism that I described before. I think it's, and I'm not really particularly enthused by a lot of this government's agenda. It seems to think that every month, every problem just needs money throwing at it. At the same time, I think that Alex had a good point when he said not just in the NHS, but in lots of spheres, we've sort of learned to do things a bit better because of COVID. So if I am optimistic, it's because of that, those kind of perhaps productivity improvements. People have changed their lifestyles a bit. So I'm going to go with a middling 5, like I think both your other panelists so far have done.
They were very middle of the road. Last week, we were monumentally optimistic. Alex, I can usually count on you to be a ray of sunshine. I'll kind of come to you next, not Snowdon. I know he's going to be a miserable old sod, but you're usually pretty upbeat.
Well, I should be a
about the
rose
years
between
ahead.
two thorns if Chris does comply with what you say. Look, since I was last on your show, trade deal with Australia, trade deal impending with New Zealand, likely that the UK joins the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership. The Office of National Statistics suggests that our economic recovery is going to be so fast that we make it a full year earlier than they projected even recently. Our infection situation with coronavirus is better than any of the most optimistic projections that Sage made, even with the points that Chris made earlier, which I think is in part down to testing more. And we no longer have the link between infection and death and hospitalization. All of those great positive things, how can it be anything other than 10? We are heading in the right direction. The answer is 10.
I was confident you were going to be give a 10. Chris, I fear you're going to snuff out the Alex Deane ray of sunshine, aren't you?
You're never going to get more than the 3 out of me. I mean, I went down to a 1 last year at the worst point, and then because of the vaccines, it went up to a 3. It's not going up to 3, not in my lifetime, certainly not for the next 10 years. The inflation is coming. That's something to start looking forward to. The economy is, it's in a very bad way. The public finances are in an absolutely catastrophic state. Net zero is going to make things much worse. Net zero is going to be Boris Johnson's poll tax. The NHS is in a terrible state and always will be. There's nothing really to be very optimistic about. So yeah, 3.
3. Blimey, yeah, I knew you'd be a bit on the low side. I'm an 8. I'm still feeling pretty optimistic. I also think, apart from the very meaningful, important things that Alex has pointed out, in 5 years' time, won't we just have successfully defended the Euros as reigning champions and also be world champions at the same time, having won that in Qatar, or twice probably over the next 5 years? So the football's probably slightly impacted my score, but I think many problems, but I reckon we can crack them if we put our mind to it. And John, Alex, Chris, thanks very much for putting your minds to cracking these problems that face Britain. and it's always a pleasure to have your company. Hope it's not too long before we meet up again in person. The overall tally for the Live with Littlewood Optimism Index was 36. That's very helpful. It's another reason I gave an 8, because 36 divided by 6 is 6. So a bit down on last week, but thanks to Alex and myself on the above average side of optimism. Chris, John, Alex, thanks so much for joining us. My great thanks to Robert and Timandra for their contributions early in the show. Thanks to all of you for watching. If you've enjoyed the show, please hit the thumbs up button. If you're not yet a subscriber to the IEA London YouTube channel, please hit the subscribe box and the notification bell. That way you'll keep up to date with all of the new content that we produce on an almost daily basis. My particular thanks to those of you who have signed up to the IEA Online Patron program. If you've got a few pennies spare, even in these troubled times, and you'd like to help us continue to broadcast, you can go to patreon.com/IEA London. Where we would gladly take a few of your pennies to keep the lights on in the studio and to keep our broadcast content of, I hope you'll agree, high quality, but also a high quantity too. Special thanks to our VIP online patrons, Richard Leader, Mark Edwards, Eric King, Timothy Worrell, and James Burns. Really appreciate your support. Please join them. Click on the link in the show notes below. We'd be very, very grateful to have your support. Most of all, however, thanks for watching. Thanks for being with us this evening. Stay safe, stay free. Over and out.